What if the greatest threat to ancient empires traveled on 4 legs, not 2? Small groups of horse riders from the Eurasian steppe repeatedly forced the world's most powerful civilizations to abandon old ways of war and invent entirely new ones. By the end of this journey, you will see how the clash between nomads and cities shaped the military and diplomatic systems we still live with today. Why did Rome fall to cavalry instead of infantry? And how did China's Great Wall rise from the dust of defeat? The answers reveal a hidden engine of transformation that pushed empires to reinvent themselves or disappear. What does it take for a civilization to survive when everything it knows about war no longer works? On the flat, open grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, a different kind of power emerged. Settled civilizations built walls and planted fields, but the nomads built something far more mobile. Their entire world moved on horseback. This single animal transformed them into a force that armies of farmers could never quite catch. A horse can travel for days, cover vast distances, and carry a rider with devastating weapons. For the people of the steppe, the horse was not just transportation. It was the center of their way of life. They learned to ride before they could walk properly, and this intimacy with the animal gave them an advantage no empire could replicate overnight. Then there was the composite bow. Unlike the simple wooden bows used by most infantry, this weapon was a masterpiece of engineering. Layers of wood, horn, and sinew were glued together under tension, creating a bow that was short enough to use from horseback but powerful enough to send an arrow through armor at over 300 yards. A rider could loose arrows while galloping at full speed, turning the entire battlefield into a storm of projectiles. The enemy would see a cloud of dust on the horizon, and before they could form ranks, arrows were already falling among them. The nomads did not need to stand still and trade volleys. They could strike, withdraw, and strike again, always staying just out of reach. But their greatest advantage was not a weapon. It was mobility on a scale that agrarian societies could barely comprehend. A steppe tribe could pack up its entire existence in a matter of hours. Yurts, families, livestock, all of it could move as one living organism across the grasslands. They did not rely on supply lines or fortified granaries. Their food walked alongside them in the form of horses, sheep, and cattle. When an area was grazed clean, they simply moved to the next valley. For a settled army, chasing such a force was a nightmare. Every day of pursuit stretched supply lines thinner. Every river crossing slowed wagons to a crawl. The nomads, by contrast, grew stronger the deeper they withdrew into the endless plain. They knew every water source, every hidden pass, every patch of good grazing. The invader stumbled blind into a world that seemed to swallow armies without a trace. Their political structure added another layer of frustration for empire builders. Steppe societies were decentralized. They did not have a single capital city that could be captured or a single ruler whose death would cause total collapse. Leadership was often shared among tribal chieftains who formed confederations in times of need and scattered in times of peace. This made them incredibly difficult to defeat in a decisive battle. You could destroy one clan, but 3 others would rise from the eastern horizon within a season. There was no throne to seize, no treasury to plunder, no palace to burn. The entire society was distributed across thousands of square miles of open land, and because they lived directly off the land, they required no elaborate logistical apparatus. A Roman legion needed grain shipments, roads, fortifications, and supply depots. A steppe army needed only grass and water. When they invaded, they carried dried meat and milk products. They could cover 50 miles in a single day while their enemies were lucky to march 15. They appeared without warning and disappeared the same way. For settled empires, this was the worst kind of enemy, a foe that followed no rules, respected no borders, and seemed to exist somewhere between the earth and the horizon. The nomads did not fight to hold ground. They fought to take what they needed and vanish into the emptiness from which they came. This asymmetry forced civilizations to ask a question they had never faced before. How do you defend against an enemy you cannot catch, cannot outrun, and cannot starve? The answer would not come easily. It would take centuries of failure and reinvention. But the steppe had already shown its hand. The horse, the bow, the mobility, the decentralized leadership, the ability to live off the land. These were not just advantages. They were a complete way of war built on a completely different relationship with the world. And that difference would push the great empires of history to their breaking point. The first shockwave hit the ancient Near East around the 8th century before the Common Era. From the northern steppe, a people known as the Cimmerians poured into Anatolia, the heart of what is now modern Turkey. They moved with terrifying speed, their horsemen spreading panic among kingdoms that had never faced such a threat. The great empire of the day, Assyria, watched these events with growing alarm. But when the Cimmerians pushed into Assyrian borders, something became clear. The old ways of war no longer worked. For centuries, the chariot had been the ultimate weapon of the battlefield. Heavy, slow, and expensive, a chariot required a driver, a warrior, and specially trained horses. It was a platform for archers or spearmen, but it could not turn quickly. It could not pursue a fleeing enemy across broken ground, and it certainly could not keep up with a mounted archer who could fire from any direction. The Cimmerians did not need chariots. They rode directly on horseback, and each rider was a self-contained weapon platform. They could circle a chariot formation, raining arrows from angles the driver could not reach. They could feign retreat, then turn and strike when the pursuers broke formation. The chariot, once the pride of empires, was suddenly obsolete against this new kind of enemy. Then came the Scythians, another steppe people, even more skilled with the composite bow. They swept into the territories of the Assyrian Empire, and their attacks were like a storm that never touched the ground. They did not seek to capture cities or hold territory. They came for plunder, for tribute, and to prove that no wall could keep them out. The Assyrians, masters of siege warfare and infantry tactics, found themselves helpless in open field engagements. Their armies could march in perfect formation, but they could not force the Scythians to stand still. The nomads simply vanished into the grasslands when faced with a large Assyrian force, only to reappear weeks later in a different province. The Assyrians needed a new solution. They could not chase ghosts forever, so they did something unprecedented. They created the first dedicated cavalry units in the ancient world. This was not merely putting a few soldiers on horses. It was a complete rethinking of military organization. The Assyrians began training horsemen who could fight from the saddle, using both bow and spear. They developed new tactics like the feigned retreat, which they learned directly from the steppe. They built stables, breeding programs, and supply systems to support mounted troops. And they integrated these cavalry units alongside their traditional chariots and infantry. The chariot did not disappear overnight, but its roles shifted. It became a command platform, a symbol of status, rather than a primary weapon of attack. The cavalry became the new shock force. This shift from chariot to mounted archer was a fundamental turning point in military history. It set a precedent that every later empire would have to follow. The Assyrians understood that to survive, they had to adopt the tactics of their enemies. They could not simply build higher walls or bigger armies. They had to learn to move like the steppe, and they did, but this adaptation came at a cost. It required resources, training, and a change in military culture that took generations to implement. The Cimmerians and Scythians did not conquer Assyria. They did not need to. They forced the Assyrians to become something new, something that no one had ever seen before. A civilization that could fight like the nomads while still maintaining its cities, its temples, and its bureaucracy. This was the first major lesson of the steppe. To survive contact with the horsemen, you had to become a little like them yourself, and that transformation would ripple outward, touching every empire that followed. Darius the Great, ruler of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, felt that ripple. Around 513 before the Common Era, he launched a massive invasion of Scythia, expecting to crush the nomadic threat once and for all. He led an army of perhaps 70,000 men across a bridge of boats over the Danube River, deep into the endless grasslands. The Scythians did not meet him in open battle. Instead, they burned the grass, poisoned the wells, and withdrew deeper into the steppe, always staying one step ahead. Darius sent messengers demanding battle, but the Scythians laughed and said they were not fleeing. They were simply moving their flocks as they always did. The Persian army grew exhausted. Its supply lines stretched to breaking point. After weeks of chasing a phantom enemy, Darius was forced to turn back, humiliated and empty-handed. He never again attempted to conquer the steppe, but he did learn a crucial lesson. The nomads could not be beaten on their own ground with traditional infantry and light cavalry alone. So the Persians did something different. They did not simply copy the steppe style of war, they transformed it. From this painful experience, the Achaemenid Empire institutionalized a new kind of soldier known as the cataphract. Both rider and horse were covered in scale armor or mail, making them nearly invulnerable to arrows from a distance. They carried a long lance for charging and a composite bow for skirmishing. This was not a light raider but a heavy hammer that could smash through formations of steppe horsemen. The cataphract could absorb the hit and run attacks and then deliver a crushing countercharge. But the Persians understood that military force alone was not enough. The steppe could not be occupied, so they built the Royal Road, an immense highway stretching from the Aegean Sea all the way to the Persian heartland. Along this road, relay stations were placed a day's ride apart, each with fresh horses and messengers. A royal order could travel from one end of the empire to the other in about a week, a journey that once took months. This communication network allowed the emperor to respond to nomadic threats faster than ever before. More importantly, it became a tool of diplomacy. The Persians could send envoys to tribal chieftains, negotiate alliances, pay subsidies, and gather intelligence, all without marching an army. They learned to manage the steppe through a blend of deterrence and gift-giving. A chieftain who accepted Persian gold and traded for goods was far less likely to raid the prosperous provinces, and if he did, the cataphracts would be there within weeks, not months. This hybrid approach, heavy cavalry for defense and a communication network for diplomacy, set a new standard. The Persians showed that surviving the steppe required more than just a better weapon. It required an entire system that moved information and power as fast as a horse could run. And that system would echo through the centuries, influencing the empires that came after, including the one that would eventually challenge Persia itself. But the Persians were not the only ones paying attention. Across the Aegean, a rising kingdom in the north of Greece began to study the steppe with the same intensity. Philip II of Macedon had spent years as a hostage in Thebes, where he learned Greek warfare inside out, but his real education came from watching his own borders. The Scythians had raided into Macedon more than once, and Philip understood that traditional hoplite phalanxes, slow-moving and rigid, could never catch these horsemen. So he did something radical. He transformed his army from a citizen militia into a professional force built on speed and coordination. He introduced a lighter, faster cavalry armed with lances and javelins, trained to charge in wedge formations and then disengage quickly. He also created the famous Macedonian phalanx, but with a twist. Each soldier carried a sarissa, a pike over 18 feet long that extended far beyond the shorter spears of Greek hoplites. This gave the infantry a deadly reach that could hold off enemy cavalry while the horsemen exploited any gaps. Philip's genius was to make every part of the army work together, not as separate blocks but as a single, flexible instrument. When his son Alexander took the throne and launched his invasion of the Persian Empire, he carried this system with him. But he soon discovered that the steppe presented challenges no drill field in Macedon could prepare him for. After defeating the main Persian army at Gaugamela, Alexander pushed east into Central Asia, into the heartland of the Scythian and Bactrian horsemen. There he faced hit-and-run tactics, ambushes from the desert, and a climate that exhausted his men. At the Jaxartes River, now the Sudaria, a large Scythian force challenged him directly. They rode along the opposite bank, taunting his army, daring him to cross. Alexander did not hesitate. He ordered his engineers to assemble rafts, and his army crossed under a hail of arrows. Once on the far bank, he unleashed his companions, the elite cavalry, in a series of sharp, coordinated charges that broke the Scythian formation and drove them from the field. But this victory was more than a battle. It was a lesson. Alexander saw that light cavalry, used properly, could match the speed of the nomads, so he did something unprecedented. He began to recruit steppe horsemen into his own ranks. He formed units of mounted archers from the Dahi and Scythian tribes, integrating them directly into his army. These were not just mercenaries, they were allies whose skills he respected and whose loyalty he won through generous gifts, marriage alliances, and a clear demonstration of power. When he married Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman, he signaled that he was not simply a conqueror from the west but a ruler who could bridge two worlds. Alexander's combined arms approach became the new standard. He used his phalanx to pin enemy infantry in place, his heavy cavalry to deliver the decisive blow, and his steppe allies to screen his flanks and harass the enemy. He could chase down fleeing foes, outmaneuver slower formations, and operate in terrain that would have stalled any earlier Greek army. By the time he reached India, his army was a living mosaic of tactics from 3 continents. The Macedonians had learned from the Scythians, from the Persians, and from their own experience, and they fused it all into a war machine that could fight anywhere. But Alexander's greatest insight was not just military. He understood that to hold the steppe, you needed its people as allies, not slaves. He left local rulers in place, kept their customs, and rewarded loyalty with respect. This approach would echo through the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed, and it taught later empires that diplomacy and integration were just as powerful as the lance and the bow. The nomads had forced civilization to reinvent war, but Alexander showed that they could also help you win it. Some threats from the steppe refused every offer of alliance. The Huns appeared on the edge of the European world around the 4th century of the Common Era, and their arrival sent shockwaves through entire populations. They were not a single unified empire, but a confederation of nomadic groups who had moved westward across the grasslands, displacing everyone in their path. Their reputation preceded them. Roman writers described them as a people who seemed to live on horseback, who ate, slept, and conducted business without ever dismounting. Whether those accounts were entirely accurate mattered less than the fear they generated. The Huns did not need to conquer every tribe they encountered. Their mere presence forced entire nations to move, and one of those nations was the Goths. The Goths, a Germanic people who had long lived along the northern borders of the Roman Empire, found themselves caught between 2 impossible forces. To the east, the Huns pressed against them, burning villages and scattering their warriors. To the west lay the Danube River and the Roman provinces beyond. The Goths had heard stories of Roman power, but they had also heard stories of Roman greed and betrayal. In the year 376, desperate and with no other choice, thousands of Goths gathered on the northern bank of the Danube and begged for permission to cross into Roman territory. They offered to serve as soldiers, to give up their weapons, to become loyal subjects of the empire. The Roman Emperor Valens saw an opportunity. He needed recruits for his army, and here was a massive pool of fighting men. He granted them entry, but the Romans made a catastrophic mistake. They did not have the resources or the organization to handle such a vast influx of people. Food supplies ran short. Corrupt officials exploited the Goths, selling them spoiled grain and demanding bribes. Roman soldiers treated the refugees with contempt. Within 2 years, the Goths had had enough. They rose in open rebellion, and Valens, confident in the superiority of his legions, marched to crush them. The two armies met near the city of Adrianople in the summer of 378. The Roman force numbered perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 men, mostly infantry. The Goths had a similar number, but they had something the Romans did not fully appreciate: heavy cavalry. These were not the light skirmishers the Romans had faced before. The Gothic horsemen had learned from their own desperate flight from the Huns. They had seen how steppe riders could turn and charge with devastating effect. They had adopted the longer lances, the heavier armor, the disciplined formations. They had become something new, something that combined the mobility of the steppe with the shock power of a Roman cataphract. The battle began badly for the Romans. Valens, impatient and perhaps arrogant, attacked before his full army had arrived. The Gothic infantry formed a defensive circle of wagons, a logger, and held firm against the initial Roman assault. Then, at the worst possible moment, the Gothic cavalry returned from a foraging expedition. They appeared on the Roman flank, a wall of horses and iron. They struck the Roman line with a force that shattered centuries of tradition. The legions, trained to fight in disciplined ranks, could not pivot fast enough to meet the charge. The cavalry drove deep into their formation, breaking it into isolated pockets. Roman soldiers were cut down where they stood. Valens himself died on the field, his body never recovered. 2/3 of the Roman army perished. Adrianople was not just a defeat, it was a death sentence for the old Roman way of war. The empire had relied on heavy infantry for over 500 years. That model died in the dust of Thrace. In the years that followed, Roman military reforms shifted decisively toward cavalry. Emperors began to recruit more horse archers, more heavy lancers, more mounted troops of every kind. The infantry became a supporting arm, not the main force. The Byzantine Empire, which rose from the ashes of Rome, would perfect this new system. Its armies would rely on armored cavalry, the cataphracts, supported by light horsemen and archers. The lesson of Adrianople echoed for a millennium. When an empire cannot adapt to a new kind of warfare, it does not simply lose a battle, it loses its identity. The Goths, who had been refugees fleeing the Huns, became the instrument that forced Rome to become something it had never been before. And the Huns, who had never even fought at Adrianople, were the invisible hand that had set the entire tragedy in motion. The Eastern Roman Empire, which history calls Byzantium, had learned the hard way that the old legions could not save them. After Adrianople, its leaders understood that survival depended on thinking like the enemy. So they did something no previous civilization had attempted on such a scale. They wrote a military manual that turned steppe warfare into a science. The Strategikon, attributed to Emperor Maurus in the late 6th century, was not just a list of battlefield commands. It was a complete philosophy of war that reversed centuries of Roman tradition. The manual openly stated that the best way to fight steppe nomads was to copy them. It recommended training soldiers to shoot arrows from horseback, to feign retreat, to harass enemy flanks, and to avoid pitched battles unless absolutely necessary. The infantry, once the pride of Rome, was now told to act as a defensive screen while mounted archers did the real work. Archers on foot were trained to fire in coordinated volleys. creating a wall of arrows that could break a charging horsemen before they reached the line. Cavalry was organized into multiple lines, each with a specific role. The first line would skirmish and draw the enemy into a trap. The second would deliver the decisive charge. The third would pursue or cover a retreat. Every movement was planned for speed and flexibility, but the Strategikon went further. It included detailed advice on how to negotiate with steppe leaders, how to gather intelligence from captured prisoners, how to use gifts to secure alliances, and how to turn one tribe against another. This was not just a manual of arms, it was a manual of survival through cunning. The Byzantines understood that you could not defeat the steppe with soldiers alone. You had to outthink them, and to outthink them, you had to understand them. So Byzantine emperors adopted a practice that would become their signature strategy. They offered subsidies and titles to friendly steppe chieftains, turning them into federate allies. The foederati were not mercenaries in the usual sense. They were entire tribal groups who entered into a formal treaty with the empire. In exchange for land, gold, or trading rights, they provided warriors to fight for Byzantium. This system had a genius built into it. It turned potential enemies into defenders of the frontier. A Bulgar or Avar chieftain who accepted Byzantine gold was far less likely to raid imperial territory. And if a rival tribe threatened, the federates would often fight them for the empire, saving Byzantine soldiers from danger. The imperial court in Constantinople became a master of gift diplomacy. Envoys traveled regularly into the steppe carrying silk, jewelry, and beautifully crafted weapons. They would shower a chieftain with presents, praise his wisdom, and propose a marriage alliance or a military partnership. This was not weakness. It was a deliberate strategy to bind steppe leaders to the empire through obligation and shared interest. The nomads, proud and suspicious of outsiders, were drawn into a web of relationships that made war less profitable than peace. Over centuries, this system allowed Byzantium to survive wave after wave of steppe invaders. The Huns, the Avars, the Bulgars, the Magyars, and later the Pechenegs and Cumans all found themselves entangled in Byzantine diplomacy. Some became enemies, but many became allies. The empire that had once despised the horse archer now rode alongside him. The Strategikon and the foederati together represented a profound transformation. Warfare was no longer about heroic charges or static formations. It had become a fluid, adaptive art that combined military power with political intelligence. The Byzantines had learned to dance with the steppe, not to crush it, and in that dance they found a way to endure for another 1,000 years. But the steppe was not finished teaching its lessons. New horsemen were always coming over the horizon, and each wave brought new challenges. The next empire that would face the ultimate test of this strategy was about to rise in the east, and it would turn the nomads themselves into its greatest weapon. For the Han Dynasty, the Xiongnu were a problem that defied every solution. These nomadic confederations had unified the northern steppe and built an empire of their own, one that threatened the very existence of China. Their horsemen could sweep across the border, loot entire provinces, and vanish before a single Chinese soldier could respond. The early Han emperors tried military campaigns, but the cost was staggering. Armies marched for months, only to find empty grasslands and burned camps. The Xiongnu simply retreated into the immensity of the steppe, waiting for the invaders to exhaust themselves. It became clear that traditional infantry, the backbone of Chinese warfare since the Warring States period, could never catch these riders. So the Han did what every great civilization before them had done. They began to reinvent themselves from the ground up. The first step was defensive. Instead of relying on scattered garrisons, the Han built a vast network of walls, watchtowers, and fortifications along their northern frontier. This was not a single continuous barrier in the way later generations would imagine. It was a system of linked strong points, signal stations, and patrol routes that stretched for thousands of miles. Soldiers stationed at these outposts could light beacon fires to warn of an approaching raid, giving the interior provinces time to prepare. Behind these walls, the Han created a logistical backbone, granaries, roads, and relay stations that allowed armies to move and supply themselves far more efficiently. The Great Wall, as we know it today, was not built in a day or even a century. It grew out of this slow, patient effort to control a border that seemed to have no natural limits. But walls alone could not stop the Xiongnu. The nomads would simply ride around them or break through at undefended stretches, so the Han turned to offense. They began breeding massive herds of horses, establishing imperial pastures in the western regions, and training tens of thousands of cavalrymen. These were not just light skirmishers. The Han developed mounted archers who could fire from the saddle and heavy lancers who could charge in formation. They also adopted the crossbow, a weapon that could be fired from horseback with devastating accuracy. By the reign of Emperor Wu in the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Han had built the largest cavalry force the world had ever seen, numbering perhaps over 100,000 horsemen. With this army, they launched deep campaigns into the steppe, pushing the Xiongnu back and establishing military garrisons in the Tarim Basin, far beyond the old frontiers. Yet even this military power had limits. The cost of maintaining such a force was enormous, and the Xiongnu remained resilient. So the Han added a third layer to their strategy, one that would prove even more enduring than walls or cavalry. This was the heqin system, a blend of tribute and marriage alliances. Under this policy, the Han sent annual gifts of silk, grain, and gold to the Xiongnu court. They also offered imperial princesses as brides to Xiongnu chieftains, binding the two ruling families through kinship. In return, the Xiongnu agreed to halt their raids and recognize the Han emperor as an equal or even a superior. To outsiders, this looked like bribery or submission, but the Han understood something crucial. It was cheaper to buy peace than to wage war. A few thousand bolts of silk could prevent a campaign that would cost tens of thousands of lives and drain the treasury. The heqin system also gave the Han a diplomatic lever. They could threaten to cut off the gifts or play one Xiongnu faction against another, keeping the steppe divided and manageable. This three-part approach, walls for defense, cavalry for offense, and heqin for diplomacy, became a template that every subsequent Chinese dynasty would study and adapt. It was not a perfect solution. The Xiongnu sometimes broke their agreements, and the Han had to adjust constantly. But the system worked for centuries, allowing China to survive and even expand while the steppe remained a constant pressure. The Han had learned to fight the nomads, to bribe them, to marry them, and to contain them within a framework of ritual and reciprocity. That framework would outlast the Han themselves, shaping Chinese foreign policy for the next 2,000 years, long after the Xiongnu had faded into history. The Tang dynasty chose to hire the steppe, not just fight it. After centuries of trying to contain nomadic threats through walls and tribute, the Tang emperors took a far more daring path. They actively recruited Turkic warriors into their armies, placed them in high command, and allowed steppe culture to flow into the very heart of the imperial court. This was not mere tolerance, it was a deliberate policy of integration that transformed the Tang military into something unprecedented. Turkic horsemen became the backbone of the imperial cavalry. Tang soldiers began wearing steppe-style clothing, trousers and boots instead of flowing robes, because they were far more practical for riding. Archery drills were redesigned around the composite bow, and entire cavalry formations were trained to fight in the looser, faster style of the nomads. The Tang even adopted the Turkic practice of using feigned retreats and flanking maneuvers, tactics that had once humiliated Chinese armies. By the early 8th century, the Tang military was a hybrid force, equally comfortable on foot or horseback, and deeply influenced by the very people they had once feared. This integration went all the way to the top. Turkic generals rose to the highest ranks, commanding armies and governing provinces. The imperial court in Xiongnu employed Turkic advisors, diplomats, and bodyguards. Marriages between Tang princesses and Turkic khans were arranged to cement alliances, echoing the old heqin system but with far more genuine partnership. For a time, this strategy seemed brilliant. The Tang expanded farther west than any previous Chinese dynasty, controlling the Silk Road and projecting power deep into Central Asia. The steppe was not a threat but a resource, a source of loyal soldiers and skilled commanders. Then came the rebellion that shattered that trust. In the middle of the 8th century, a general named Lushan rose against the Tang emperor. Lushan was himself a product of the integration policy. He was of Sogdian and Turkic origin, a man who had climbed the military ranks through talent and ambition, eventually commanding a huge army in the northeast. When he declared rebellion in the year 755, he turned the very weapon the Tang had built against them. His forces included tens of thousands of Turkic and other steppe horsemen, trained in the same tactics the Tang had adopted. They moved with speed, struck with precision, and overwhelmed the imperial garrisons that had grown soft from years of peace. The rebellion lasted 8 years, devastated the capital, and caused immense loss of life. The Tang never fully recovered their former strength. This was the double-edged sword of steppe integration. By absorbing Turkic warriors into their military, the Tang gained a powerful tool. But that tool could be seized and wielded by a rebellious commander who understood the system from the inside. And Lushan was not an outsider breaking through the wall. He was an insider who had learned everything the Tang had to teach and used it against them. The revolt forced the Tang to rely even more heavily on local warlords and foreign mercenaries, fragmenting the empire's authority. The dynasty survived, but its golden age was over. The lesson was painful. When you invite the steppe into your army, you also invite its unpredictability, its independence, and its potential for betrayal. The Tang had tried to tame the steppe by becoming part of it, and for a time it worked beautifully, but the steppe was never something you could fully control. It could turn on you as easily as it fought for you, leaving even the most powerful empire to wonder if the price of integration was too high. The Abbasid Caliphate, ruling from its glittering capital of Baghdad, faced a familiar problem. Its vast empire stretched from North Africa to Central Asia, and along its northern and eastern frontiers, Turkic steppe tribes pressed against its borders. These horsemen were exactly the kind of enemy that had plagued every great civilization before them. They raided, vanished, and refused to be pinned down in a decisive battle. But the Abbasids had a different idea about how to handle the steppe. Instead of building walls or chasing nomads across endless plains, they decided to recruit the steppe itself into their army in a way that no one had ever tried before. They created a system of military slavery known as the ghilman. These were young men, often captured in raids or purchased from the steppe tribes, who were brought to Baghdad and trained from childhood to become elite soldiers. They were given the finest weapons, the best horses, and a discipline that rivaled any military order in the world. In theory, they were perfect soldiers. They had no ties to local families, no loyalty to tribal chieftains, no political ambitions of their own. They belonged entirely to the caliph. Their only purpose was to serve him, protect him, and fight his wars. For decades, this system worked brilliantly. The ghilman became the most feared fighting force in the Islamic world. They crushed rebellions, defended the frontiers against Byzantine raids, and projected Abbasid power across 3 continents. They were a living shield, a sword that the caliph could wield without fear of betrayal. But the very qualities that made them so effective also contained the seeds of a dangerous transformation. These young men grew up together in the barracks, isolated from the rest of society. They developed a fierce loyalty to each other, to their commanders, and to the institution that had raised them. That loyalty eventually outweighed any loyalty they felt to the distant caliph who ruled from behind palace walls. As the decades passed, the Ghilman began to realize their own power. They saw that the caliph depended on them absolutely. Without their swords, the empire would crumble, and they began to act on that knowledge. They demanded higher pay, better positions, and greater influence over state decisions. When the caliph tried to resist, they simply marched into the palace and installed a new ruler who would listen. By the middle of the 9th century, the Ghilman had seized effective control of the Abbasid capital. The caliph became a figurehead, a man who wore the title but held no real authority. The military caste that was supposed to be a tool had become the master. This was not a simple coup. It was a complete reversal of the political order. The Abbasid dynasty had built its legitimacy on the idea that the caliph was God's shadow on earth, the protector of the faithful. But when the Ghilman took control, that sacred authority evaporated. The caliph could no longer even guarantee his own safety. The army, not the throne, now made the decisions. The consequences rippled across the entire Islamic world. Provincial governors, seeing the caliph's weakness, began to assert their own independence. Local dynasties emerged in Egypt, Persia, and Central Asia, each with its own army, its own ambitions. The once unified caliphate splintered into a mosaic of rival states. But the Ghilman system did not disappear. It became a model that every successor state copied. The Samanids, the Ghaznavids, the Seljuks, and later the Mamluks all built their military power on the same foundation of Turkic slave soldiers. They refined the system, made it more stable, and learned from the Abbasid mistakes. The Mamluks of Egypt, especially, would prove that a Ghilman-based state could actually outlast and defeat even the most fearsome steppe invaders, including the Mongol horde. The strategic centralization that the Abbasids had attempted, putting all military power in the hands of a single ruler, was replaced by a more distributed model. Power was still rooted in the sword, but that sword now answered to a commander who understood the steppe from the inside. This transformation forced a reinvention of political structures across the Islamic world. The old model of a hereditary caliphate gave way to a new reality. If you wanted to rule, you had to earn the loyalty of the military, and that meant understanding the men of the steppe, their traditions, their code of honor, and their expectations. The Ghilman were not just soldiers, they were a bridge between two worlds, the settled empires of the Middle East and the nomadic horsemen of the Central Asian plains. The Abbasids had tried to tame the steppe by turning it into a weapon. In the end, the steppe tamed them, forcing the entire Islamic civilization to adapt to a new kind of political order where military power and steppe culture were inseparable. Far from Baghdad, another set of rulers found themselves caught between worlds. The Crusader states, those fragile Christian kingdoms carved into the Levant after the First Crusade, had spent generations fighting for survival. They were surrounded by Muslim powers that grew stronger with each passing decade, and their supply lines back to Europe stretched across a sea and a continent. By the middle of the 13th century, they faced a terrifying new variable. The Mongols were sweeping westward, destroying everything in their path. For the Crusader nobles, this presented a strange opportunity and an even stranger dilemma. The Mongols had already crushed the Muslim armies of Persia and Anatolia. They had sacked Baghdad, the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, in 1258. On the surface, this should have been good news for the Christians. Their traditional enemies were being humbled by a force from the east, but the Mongols were not Christians either. They followed their own steppe traditions, their own shamans, and their own code of conquest. Nobody knew if they would stop once the Muslim states were destroyed, or if they would turn on the Crusader kingdoms next. This uncertainty sparked one of the most remarkable diplomatic experiments of the medieval world. The Crusader leaders decided to reach out to the Mongol Khans and propose an alliance against their common Muslim enemies. Bohemond VI, the Prince of Antioch, was among the first to take this bold step. He sent envoys to the Mongol court bearing gifts and offers of cooperation. His logic was simple: the Mamluks of Egypt were the greatest threat to his principality. If the Mongols could help crush them, Antioch would have room to breathe, and if the Mongol leader happened to be favorable to Christianity, so much the better. There was some reason for hope. Several Mongol princesses and generals were Nestorian Christians, a branch of the faith that had spread across the steppe centuries earlier. The great Khan himself, Monk, had shown respect for all religions, hosting debates between Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Taoists at his court. Some Crusader leaders even dared to believe that the Mongols might convert, that a vast Christian empire from the east would come to their rescue. King Louis IX of France, a man deeply devoted to his faith, also sent envoys to the Mongol court. He carried letters filled with religious language, urging the Khan to embrace Christianity and join the Crusader cause. The Khan's response was polite but firm. He thanked Louis for his message, but he made it clear that the Mongols did not serve any foreign king. If Louis wanted peace, he should submit to Mongol authority. The Khan expected tribute, not partnership. This was a fundamental misunderstanding of steppe diplomacy. The Mongols did not think in terms of equal alliances with settled rulers. They saw the world as a hierarchy with themselves at the top. A foreign king could either submit and become a vassal, or resist and be destroyed. There was no middle ground, no treaty between equals. Bohemond VI, however, managed to achieve a limited success. In 1260, he fought alongside Mongol forces when they captured Aleppo and Damascus. For a brief moment, it looked like the Crusader-Mongol alliance might actually work, but the partnership was fragile and based on mutual convenience, not trust. When the Mongols withdrew eastward to deal with a succession crisis, they left the Crusader states exposed. The Mamluks, who had been gathering strength, struck back. In the years that followed, they captured Antioch itself, Bohemond's own capital, and reduced the Crusader kingdom to a coastal strip. The hope of a Christian-Mongol alliance died in the dust of those battles. Looking back, this episode is both tragic and instructive. The Crusader leaders were desperate, and their desperation led them to imagine a partnership that the Mongols never truly offered. But the attempt itself was unprecedented. For centuries, Western Christendom had viewed non-Christian powers as enemies to be crushed or converted. The idea of forming a diplomatic alliance with a pagan or Muslim state was almost unthinkable. Yet here were Crusader princes sending envoys to the court of a steppe conqueror, negotiating gifts, promises, and military coordination. This broke the old mold of diplomacy. It opened a door that would never fully close again. Later European powers, facing their own strategic dilemmas, would remember that the Mongols had been worth talking to, even if the talks failed. The precedent had been set. Diplomacy could cross religious lines. It could serve practical interests rather than sacred ones. The steppe had not only forced empires to reinvent their armies. It had forced them to reinvent how they thought about the stranger beyond the horizon. The Crusader envoys to the Mongol court were a clumsy first attempt, full of hope and betrayal, but they planted a seed that would grow into the complex diplomatic systems of the modern world. The Mongols did not just conquer, they transformed the very nature of war. When Genghis Khan united the fragmented tribes of the steppe in the early 13th century, he unleashed a force that combined every lesson earlier nomads had learned and added something entirely new. His revolution was not simply about riding fast and shooting arrows. It was about organization on a scale no steppe confederation had ever attempted. He imposed a strict decimal system on his army, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 horsemen, each commanded by an officer chosen for skill, not lineage. This broke the old tribal loyalties and created a machine that could maneuver with precision across vast distances. Every soldier knew his place and his leader. Orders flowed from the top down through a chain of command that could shift tactics in minutes. But mobility alone would never conquer the great walled cities of China, Persia, and the Middle East. Genghis understood this, so he did something that shocked the settled world. He did not despise the skills of farmers and artisans. He actively recruited them. When his armies defeated a kingdom, they did not simply slaughter everyone. They searched for engineers, craftsmen, and scholars. Chinese engineers who had built siege towers and catapults were pressed into service. Persian experts in mining and sapping joined the Mongol ranks. Within a generation, the Mongol army became a hybrid that terrified even the most fortified cities. Horse archers would screen the approach while engineers assembled trebuchets and battering rams. They could dig tunnels under walls, launch fire projectiles, and build pontoon bridges across rivers. The same nomads who had once been helpless before a stone wall now brought those walls crashing down. The key to making all this work was communication. Genghis instituted the Yam system, a relay network of stations spaced about a day's ride apart across the entire empire. Each station had fresh horses, food, and a rider ready to go at a moment's notice. A message could travel from one end of the Mongol domain to the other in a matter of weeks, a journey that once took months. This allowed the Khan to coordinate campaigns that spanned thousands of miles. He could order an army in Persia to halt while a force in China advanced. He could receive intelligence from scouts and adapt his strategy before the enemy even knew he was coming. For the settled states, this was bewildering. They were used to slow-moving armies that spent months gathering supplies. The Mongols could appear without warning, strike from multiple directions at once, and then vanish into the steppe, only to reappear at a different border the following season. The combination of speed, siegecraft, and communication forced every civilization that faced the Mongols to either adapt or be destroyed. The Khwarezmian Empire crumbled because its decentralized forces could not coordinate against a single, mobile enemy. The Song dynasty of China, with its massive armies and long traditions, was outflanked and overwhelmed. Even the Mamluks, who ultimately defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut, had learned from earlier defeats and adopted steppe tactics themselves. The Mongol Revolution was not just a military event. It was a forcing function that demanded total reinvention. Any state that could not match their speed, their siege capability, and their communication system was doomed to fall. Those that survived, like the Mamluks and later the Ottomans, did so by incorporating Mongol methods into their own military structures. The steppe had once again forced civilization to change. Only this time the change was not gradual. It was a violent, explosive restructuring of the entire art of war, and its echoes would be felt for centuries. In the spring of 1241, the horsemen appeared on the frozen rivers of Hungary, and Europe realized it had never faced anything like them. The Mongol army crossed the Carpathian Mountains with a speed that seemed impossible. Within weeks, they had shattered the Hungarian forces at the Battle of Mohyl, while another column crushed the Poles at Liegnitz. The heavy cavalry of Europe, the knights in their shining armor who had dominated battlefields for centuries, charged into the Mongol lines expecting to shatter them. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by horsemen who never stopped moving. The knights were trained for a single thunderous charge, a wall of steel that would break any enemy who dared to stand. But the Mongols did not stand. They feigned retreat, drawing the knights into a chaotic pursuit, then turned and encircled them. Light cavalry arrows rained from all directions, finding gaps in the armor. The knights could not pivot, could not outrun, could not even see their tormentors clearly through the dust and chaos. Within hours, two of the most powerful armies in Central Europe had ceased to exist. The shock was absolute. Chroniclers wrote of a terror that gripped the continent. The Mongols did not just defeat armies, they seemed to erase them. They moved faster than any messenger could warn, and they appeared to know the terrain better than the people who had lived there for generations. Europe had no answer. The old feudal system, where each lord raised his own soldiers and fought his own battles, was hopeless against an enemy that coordinated across whole continents. The Mongol invasion of 1241 did not end with the destruction of Hungary and Poland. The Mongols withdrew to deal with a succession crisis in their homeland, but the memory of their speed and ferocity burned itself into European military thought. Over the following decades, rulers across the continent began to change how they built their armies. The first change was in fortifications. Castles had long been the centerpiece of medieval defense, tall stone walls designed to withstand sieges by other Europeans. But the Mongols had shown that they could bypass even the strongest castles, simply riding around them and destroying the countryside. So engineers redesigned castles to be lower, thicker, and surrounded by multiple layers of walls and ditches. They built concentric fortresses where archers could fire from covered positions, and where gates were protected by barbicans and moats. The goal was no longer just to hold out against a siege. It was to slow down an enemy that could otherwise move at lightning speed. The second adaptation was in cavalry itself. European armies began to field more light cavalry, horse archers of their own, often recruited from the steppe peoples who lived on the fringes of the continent, like the Cumans and the Mongols themselves. These riders could scout, harass, and screen the slower knights. They could also counter the Mongol tactic of feigned retreat by refusing to take the bait. By the 14th century, European armies were far more balanced between heavy and light horse, a change that had its roots in the terror of 1241. Intelligence gathering became an obsession. European courts began to send spies and envoys deep into the steppe, learning the languages, the politics, the divisions among the Mongol khans. The most famous of these missions was that of the Franciscan friar John of Plano-Carpini, who traveled all the way to the Mongol capital of Karakorum in the 1240s. He returned with detailed reports on Mongol tactics, weaponry, and the internal rivalries that could be exploited. His writings became a manual for survival, studied by kings and generals across the continent. Diplomatic missions to the Mongol court became more frequent as European rulers tried to understand the intentions of these terrifying newcomers. They sent gifts, offered alliances, and gathered every scrap of information they could. The shock of 1241 had taught Europe that ignorance was a death sentence. The steppe could no longer be dismissed as a distant problem for someone else. It had become a central factor in European strategy, one that forced the continent to look outward, to learn, and to adapt in ways that would eventually help it project power across the world. But the steppe had a final trick, one that turned its own children into masters of fire and smoke. The empires that rose after the Mongol collapse were not built by settled farmers or distant kings. They were founded by the very horsemen who had once terrified the world. The Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals all traced their origins to the Turkic and Mongol nomads of Central Asia. Men who had grown up in the saddle, who knew the rhythm of the steppe better than anyone, now sat on thrones from the Balkans to India, and they faced an old problem. How do you control a vast territory when your own cousins are still raiding from the grasslands? Their answer was a substance that would rewrite the rules of war forever. Gunpowder. The Ottomans were the first to embrace it fully. They recruited Christian boys from the Balkans, trained them in the latest firearms, and turned them into an elite infantry corps called the Janissaries. These soldiers carried long muskets and could fire in disciplined volleys, a tactic that no steppe horseman could outrun. When the Ottomans faced the mounted archers of the Safavids or the nomadic tribes of Anatolia, they did not try to match their speed. They planted rows of Janissaries behind a screen of wagons and trenches. The horses charged, but they met a wall of lead. The Safavids in Persia, also descended from steppe warriors, took a different path. They adopted cannons, heavy artillery that could batter down the walls of fortresses and smash cavalry formations before they got close. Their Shah, Abbas the Great, built a standing army of musketeers and artillerymen, recruited from the sedentary population of Persia, not from the nomadic tribes. He used these forces to crush the Uzbek horsemen who raided from the north and to push back the Ottomans themselves. The steppe way of war, hit and run, open field dominance, was suddenly vulnerable. A horse archer could not outrun a cannonball. He could not charge through a volley of musket fire without losing half his riders in seconds. The Mughals in India, another dynasty with roots in the steppe, brought the transformation to its logical conclusion. Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, was a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan. He knew cavalry tactics inside out, but when he invaded India, he faced armies that outnumbered him massively, with war elephants and heavy cavalry. At the Battle of Panipat in 1526, Babur did something that would have shocked his ancestors. He lashed together hundreds of wagons, connected them with ropes and chains, and placed his cannons and musketeers behind this barrier. The enemy charged with elephants and horsemen, but they could not break through the line of fire. Babur's guns tore them apart before they ever reached his soldiers. The steppe had given birth to these empires, but gunpowder allowed them to transcend the steppe. They no longer needed to rely solely on nomadic horsemen. They could build armies from peasants, from slaves, from anyone willing to hold a musket and stand in formation. This created a new kind of military power, one that was centralized, disciplined, and dangerous to any open field force. Yet the old nomads did not disappear. They adapted too. The Kazakhs, the Turkmens, the Uzbeks all learned to use firearms. They purchased muskets from the settled empires and incorporated them into their hit-and-run tactics. But the balance had shifted. A fortified position with cannons and volley fire could now hold off a charge that would have swept away any army from earlier centuries. The steppe's traditional dominance of open fields was no longer guaranteed, marking a turning point that would echo into the age of empires and colonies, where the rifle and the cannon would finally tame the grasslands that had once been unconquerable. The children of the steppe had used gunpowder to build their own thrones, and in doing so, they had signed the steppe's old way of war into history. Before gunpowder, the steppe taught every empire that a simple wall was never enough. For centuries, the basic model of fortification had remained largely unchanged. A Roman fort was a rectangle with tall, thin walls, towers at intervals, and a single gate. It was designed to hold off barbarian tribes who lacked siege engines and tactical coordination. But the Mongols did not come with ladders and ramshackle battering rams. They came with Chinese engineers who knew exactly where to dig a tunnel, and Persian siege experts who could assemble a trebuchet in a single night. A wall that had stood for generations could be brought down in a week. The Romans had built their forts to slow down a predictable enemy. The steppe sent an enemy who was anything but predictable. The first response came in Europe, where the shock of 1241 had not faded. Castle builders began to abandon the old square keeps and thin curtain walls. In their place rose something far more resilient, the concentric castle. Imagine a fortress within a fortress within a fortress, an outer wall low and thick designed to absorb bombardment. Behind it, a second wall, higher and stronger, with towers that overlooked the first. And at the center, a heavily fortified inner stronghold where the garrison could make a final stand. This design forced any attacker to break through multiple layers, all while being shot at from every angle. The gates were no longer simple wooden doors. They were protected by barbicans, curved outer works that funneled attackers into a killing zone. Moats were widened and deepened. Arrow slits were placed so that every inch of the outer wall could be covered by archers firing from protected positions. The goal was not just to keep the enemy out, but to make the cost of entry so high that even the most determined besieger would think twice. The Mongols had shown that a single wall was a gamble. If it fell, everything fell. With concentric defenses, a breach in the outer wall only led to more walls, more arrows, more time. Time was the one thing the steppe horsemen never had enough of. They relied on speed and surprise. A siege that dragged on for months could ruin a campaign. In the east, the lesson was even more dramatic. The Ming dynasty, which rose after the Mongol Yuan dynasty fell, inherited a frontier that stretched for thousands of miles. The old Han and Tang walls had fallen into decay, and the new threat from the steppe, the Rewrote Mongols and other confederations, could move across the open plains with devastating speed. The Ming knew they could not build walls tall enough to keep the horsemen out entirely, so they did something different. They rebuilt the Great Wall not as a single barrier, but as an integrated defensive system. Watchtowers were spaced so that smoke signals by day and beacon fires by night could send a warning across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. Garrisons were stationed at regular intervals, each one capable of supporting its neighbors in case of attack. Gates were fortified with multiple layers of walls and drawbridges, so that even if one section was breached, the invaders could be trapped between two gates and annihilated. But the most important innovation came from an unexpected source: gunpowder. As cannons became more common in the 14th and 15th centuries, the old high walls became a liability. A tall stone wall made an excellent target for cannonballs, so engineers began to lower the walls and thicken them with earth ramps behind the stone facing. They built angled bastions, triangular projections that allowed defenders to fire along the face of the wall, sweeping it with cannon fire from the sides. This was the Trace Italian, the Star Fort, and it would dominate military architecture for the next 300 years. The steppe had started this chain of transformation. The horsemen forced builders to think in depth, to plan for the worst, and to accept that a single line of defense was never enough. From the concentric castles of Europe to the massive frontier system of Ming China, every wall, every bastion, every cannon emplacement carried the invisible signature of the Mongol rider who had once ridden past walls that were too thin and too high. The fortifications of the gunpowder age were not built to impress. They were built to survive the steppe, and in surviving, they changed the face of war forever. But the steppe did not only reshape walls and weapons. It forced civilizations to rethink how they spoke to one another across borders. Before the horsemen arrived, diplomacy between settled powers had followed a relatively predictable script. Ambassadors were exchanged, treaties were signed, and borders were marked by mutual understanding or armed stalemate. The nomads broke that script entirely. They did not recognize permanent boundaries the way farming societies did. They saw land as something to be used, not owned, and they saw other rulers not as equals but as potential partners, rivals, or subjects depending on the moment. This demanded a new kind of diplomacy, one that was flexible, generous when it needed to be, and ruthless when it had to be. The first innovation was tribute. In the old thinking, tribute meant one thing: a weaker state paid a stronger state to avoid destruction. The steppe flipped this idea on its head. For the nomads, tribute was not a sign of inferiority. It was a transaction, a recognition that both sides had something the other wanted. The settled empire wanted peace. The steppe wanted goods it could not produce itself: silk, grain, metal tools, luxury items. So the nomads demanded annual payments, and in return they promised not to raid. To the Chinese, this felt like a humiliation at first. Paying the Xiongnu to stay away seemed like admitting weakness. But over time, the Han Dynasty realized that tribute was actually a form of leverage. They could threaten to withhold the payments or increase them to favor one chieftain over another, sowing division among the tribes. The system became a delicate dance of mutual dependence. The nomads needed the goods and the empire needed the peace. Each payment was a negotiation, not a surrender. The second innovation was the practice of exchanging hostages. This was not a new idea in itself. Ancient Greeks and Romans had swapped prisoners or taken noble children as guarantees of good behavior. But the steppe made it systematic and deeply personal. A Roman emperor negotiating with Attila the Hun might send a member of his own family to the Hunnic court as a living pledge of his sincerity. A Xiongnu chieftain might dispatch his own son to the Han capital, where the boy would be raised and educated in Chinese ways, learning the language and customs of the empire. On the surface, this was a guarantee. If either side broke the agreement, the hostage would suffer the consequences, but the practice had a subtler effect. The children of steppe leaders grew up immersed in the culture of the settled world. They made friends, learned the arts of courtly life, and developed a genuine attachment to their hosts. When they returned home to rule, they often carried with them a deep understanding of the empire's perspective. They became bridges between two worlds, men who could negotiate from a place of genuine empathy. The same dynamic worked in reverse. A Roman noble held in the Hun camp might come to respect the steppe way of life, its harsh honesty, its loyalty, its unforgiving code of honor. Hostages were not just prisoners, they were living ambassadors shaped by their captivity into instruments of future understanding. The third and most profound innovation was marriage alliance. The steppe understood kinship as the strongest bond between peoples. Blood ties meant loyalty. They meant that your enemy was my enemy, and your victory was my victory. So empires learned to offer their daughters, their sisters, their nieces to steppe chieftains as brides. The Byzantine Empire did this regularly with Turkic khans, sending imperial princesses across the Danube or into the Anatolian highlands to seal treaties. These women were not simply gifts. They were political agents carrying with them the customs, the language, and the interests of Byzantium. A Turkic Khan who married a Byzantine princess gained a direct connection to the most powerful court in Christendom. His children would be half Byzantine, heirs to a dual heritage that made conflict less likely and cooperation more natural. The most famous example of this was the alliance between the Byzantine emperor and the Turkic Khaganate against the Sasanian Persians in the 6th century. The marriage cemented a partnership that reshaped the balance of power across the Middle East. The Mongols, too, understood this language. They offered their own princesses to European kings and to Muslim sultans, creating webs of kinship that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. The Crusader leaders who sent envoys to the Mongol court were not just requesting a military alliance. They were proposing a family bond, a connection that would outlast any single battle. Marriage diplomacy transformed interstate relations from temporary agreements into lasting commitments. A treaty could be broken with a new ruler. A marriage could not be undone without dishonor. The steppe had taught the world that the most durable peace was written not on parchment but in bloodlines. These three innovations, tribute as a two-way system, hostages as living bridges, and marriage as a tool of statecraft, did not disappear when the Mongol Empire faded. They became embedded in the diplomatic toolkit of every major power. Renaissance princes exchanged hostages as guarantees of treaties. European monarchs married their children across borders to secure alliances. Colonial empires paid tribute to local rulers to maintain peace on distant frontiers. The steppe had invented a new grammar of diplomacy, one that treated relationships as assets and negotiation as a long game. And that grammar would shape how nations spoke to each other long after the last horse archer had thundered across the plain. The steppe did not just change how empires spoke to each other. It forced them to rethink how they defended their borders every single day. The old model, where a king raised an army only when an enemy appeared, could not survive contact with horsemen who could ride from the horizon to the capital in a matter of weeks. By the time a feudal lord gathered his vassals and marched north, the raiders would already be gone, their camps packed, their herds moving east. A standing army ready at a moment's notice became a necessity rather than a luxury. The Roman Empire had always maintained legions, but those legions were often concentrated in provincial capitals or sent on campaign. After the disaster at Adrianople and the relentless pressure of Hunnic and later Avar raids, the Romans reorganized their frontier defenses. They created the limitanae, a force of soldiers who were more than just garrison troops. These men were farmers and soldiers at the same time, stationed permanently along the border. They built their homes near the forts, raised families, and knew every path and water source for miles around. When a raiding party appeared, the limitanae did not wait for orders from a distant general. They responded immediately, slowing the enemy until heavier reinforcements could arrive. This was a profound shift. The empire was no longer relying on a mobile field army that rushed to trouble spots. It was embedding soldiers into the landscape itself, making the border a living organism of watchfulness. In China, the same logic produced a similar system. The Ming Dynasty stationed hundreds of thousands of troops along the northern frontier, not in a single massive army but in a web of garrisons, each with its own responsibility. These soldiers were not mercenaries or conscripts serving a single season. They were professional soldiers who spent their entire careers on the wall. They manned the watchtowers, maintained the signal fires, and patrolled the grasslands beyond the ramparts. Their families lived in nearby towns, and their children often followed them into service. The state supplied them with grain, armor, and weapons, creating a permanent military class that had no other occupation. This was expensive. It required a bureaucracy to manage logistics, a treasury to pay salaries, and a system of inspection to prevent corruption. But the cost of a standing army was still lower than the cost of a single major invasion that destroyed 3 provinces. The Ottoman Empire took this idea even further. The Janissaries were not just a frontier militia. They were the first professional standing army in Europe since the fall of Rome that was entirely dependent on the state. Recruited as boys from Christian families, they were raised in barracks, trained in weapons and tactics, and forbidden to marry or own property until later reforms. Their only loyalty was to the Sultan. They lived and breathed military life, and they were paid a regular salary, something almost unheard of in medieval Europe where soldiers often served for loot rather than wages. This professionalization gave the Ottomans a decisive advantage. While European kings struggled to keep armies together after a campaign season ended, the Janissaries were always ready. They drilled year-round, maintained their equipment, and could be deployed at any moment. When a steppe raid threatened the northern border, the Janissaries could march within days, not weeks. They did not need to wait for feudal levies or mercenary contracts. They were the state's permanent fist, but standing armies were only half the story. The steppe also gave birth to a different kind of military institution, one that existed on the edge of empires, neither fully controlled nor entirely independent. These were the border warrior societies, men who lived so close to the grasslands that they had absorbed the nomads' way of life while remaining loyal to the settled powers. The most famous of these were the Cossacks, emerging along the frontier between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Russian Tsardom. The Cossacks were a mix of runaway serfs, adventurers, and local Slavs who had adopted steppe horsemanship and survival skills. They lived in fortified settlements along the Dnieper and Don rivers, and they earned their living by raiding and by serving as mercenaries for whichever empire paid them. To the Poles, they were a useful buffer against Crimean Tatar raids. To the Russians, they became the tip of the spear for expansion into Siberia and the Caucasus. The Cossacks were professional warriors, but they were not a state army. They elected their own leaders, known as atamans, and they operated under their own code of honor. They could be fiercely loyal or fiercely independent depending on the moment. When the Russian Tsar needed to defend the southern frontier, he would call on the Cossacks, who would ride out with their sabers and their fast horses, fighting in the same hit-and-run style as the steppe nomads they opposed. They were the mirror image of the enemy, using the same tactics but serving a settled master. This created a fascinating dynamic. The Cossacks were both a defense against the steppe and a tool of expansion into the steppe. They could raid Tatar camps with the same ferocity that the Tatars used against Russian villages. They knew the grasslands, the river crossings, the winter holds. They were a living bridge between two worlds, and empires used them shamelessly. The Janissaries, the Limitane, the Chinese garrison troops, and the Cossacks all represented a single underlying truth. The constant pressure of the steppe had forced the creation of military institutions that were permanent, professional, and deeply embedded in the borderlands. These institutions did not just defend, they defined the very nature of the state. An empire that could maintain a standing army and a reliable border militia was an empire that could survive. One that relied on ad hoc levies and forgotten forts was an empire waiting to be overrun. The steppe, by its relentless presence, had taught civilization that war could no longer be a seasonal activity. It had to be a constant, everyday reality, and the men who lived that reality, whether in a Roman fort, a Chinese watchtower, an Ottoman barracks, or a Cossack settlement, became the backbone of a new kind of power, one that would shape the borders of the modern world. The constant pressure from the steppe may have triggered a revolution that reshaped the entire world. Historians have long debated what caused the dramatic transformation in European warfare between the 15th and 17th centuries, a period often called the Military Revolution. The traditional story credits internal developments: the rise of gunpowder, the spread of cannons, the construction of star-shaped fortresses, and the creation of standing armies funded by centralized states. But a quieter, more controversial argument suggests that the steppe played a hidden role in this transformation. The idea goes like this: for centuries, European kingdoms faced periodic invasions from nomadic horsemen, the Huns, the Avars, the Magyars, the Mongols, and later the Tatars. Each wave forced them to adapt. They built heavier cavalry, the knights of the Middle Ages, to counter the speed of steppe riders. They developed fortified castles with concentric walls to withstand sieges that could now be conducted by engineers captured from the east. They learned the value of light horse archers and recruited steppe peoples into their own armies. These adaptations, piecemeal at first, gradually built a military culture that was uniquely resilient and flexible. When the age of gunpowder arrived, European states did not have to start from scratch. They already possessed the administrative systems to maintain permanent forces, the logistical expertise to supply armies on the move, and the engineering knowledge to build defenses that could resist any attack. The steppe had acted as a kind of training ground, forcing European kingdoms to develop the very institutions that would later allow them to project power across the oceans. There is evidence to support this view. The French and English monarchies, for example, began to create standing armies in the late Middle Ages, partly in response to the threat of mounted raids from the Scottish border or the Welsh marches, threats that had their own echoes of steppe-style mobility. The Spanish tercios, the famous infantry squares that dominated European battlefields for a century, were designed to withstand cavalry charges, a direct lesson from the age of knights and horse archers. The Portuguese and Spanish explorers who sailed to Africa, Asia, and the Americas carried with them not just guns and ships, but a military mindset forged in centuries of fighting fast-moving enemies from open plains. On the other side of the argument, critics point out that the military revolution was primarily driven by internal European dynamics, the competition between emerging nation-states, the growth of commerce, and the technological breakthroughs of the Renaissance. They argue that the steppe threat had largely receded by the time gunpowder became decisive. The Mongol invasions ended in the 13th century, and the last major nomadic raids into Central Europe were conducted by the Crimean Tatars in the 16th and 17th centuries, by which point European armies were already transformed. The real catalyst, they say, was the development of artillery and the subsequent redesign of fortifications, which created an arms race that only wealthy, centralized states could win. The steppe, in this view, was a sideshow, not a primary cause. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. The steppe did not single-handedly cause the military revolution, but it did create the conditions that made certain adaptations more urgent and more natural. European states that could not field effective cavalry or defend their borders against raiders simply did not survive. Those that did, such as the Kingdom of Hungary, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Russian Tsardom, developed military traditions that blended Western and steppe influences. These hybrid forces later proved remarkably effective when deployed against entirely different enemies in distant continents. The British redcoats who fought in India and Africa, for example, were trained in linear tactics that had their roots in the need to withstand massed cavalry charges, a need that had once been driven by horsemen from the grasslands. The Spanish conquistadors who toppled the Aztec and Inca empires relied on a combination of gunpowder, steel, and a disciplined cavalry that could outmaneuver dense formations of infantry. That cavalry tradition had been honed over centuries of fighting Moors and steppe raiders, so the steppe factor remains a compelling piece of the puzzle, even if it is not the whole picture. It suggests that the rise of European global dominance was not simply a story of internal genius or technological luck. It was also a story of adaptation, of learning from enemies who seemed primitive but who forced civilizations to evolve in ways that no one could have predicted. The horsemen who rode out of the grasslands did not conquer the world, but they may have helped create the very tool kit that allowed others to do so. On the Indian subcontinent, the steppe did not just influence from afar. It took the throne. The Delhi Sultanate, founded by Turkic and Afghan horsemen who had ridden south through the Khyber Pass, was the first great experiment in blending the military traditions of the grasslands with the complexities of settled Indian civilization. These conquerors brought with them everything they had learned from centuries of steppe warfare: massed cavalry, lightning raids, and the composite bow. But they also encountered something new: dense jungles, massive river systems, and armies that fought with war elephants, a weapon no steppe horseman had ever faced. The early sultans realized that simply charging into battle with horse archers would not be enough. They needed to adapt, so they began to integrate Indian war elephants into their own forces, using them as mobile platforms for archers and as shock troops that could break infantry lines. They also introduced a new kind of cavalry, the heavy lancer, clad in chain mail and armed with long spears, capable of charging through elephant formations. Horse breeding became a matter of state policy. The Delhi sultans imported Arabian and Turkic stallions, established imperial stud farms, and created a network of horse traders that stretched from Central Asia to Bengal. A good horse was worth its weight in silver, and the Sultanate invested heavily in ensuring its cavalry remained the finest in the region. But the most lasting innovation came with the Mughals, who were themselves descendants of both Timur and Genghis Khan. Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, understood that to rule India, he could not simply rely on the old steppe methods. He needed a system that could bind together the diverse peoples of his new realm. That system was the Mansabdari. Under this arrangement, every military officer, known as a Mansabdar, was assigned a rank that determined his salary, the number of horsemen he was expected to maintain, and his place in the imperial hierarchy. The rank was not hereditary. It was granted by the emperor and could be revoked at any time. This gave the Mughal ruler immense control over his military elite. A Mansabdar who had risen from the steppe, commanding thousands of Turkic, Persian, or Afghan horsemen, could be moved from one province to another, preventing him from building a local power base. His loyalty was tied directly to the throne, not to his tribe or his homeland. The system also allowed the Mughals to incorporate Hindu Rajput princes into the imperial military. These princes were given mansabs in exchange for their service, and they brought their own cavalry traditions into the Mughal fold. The result was a multi-ethnic army that combined the speed of steppe horsemen with the discipline of settled infantry and the terror of war elephants. The Mansabdari was more than a military organization. It was a diplomatic masterwork, a way to manage the ambitions of steppe origin elites by turning them into salaried servants of the state. A Turkic noble who might have dreamed of carving out his own kingdom in the hills was instead given a lucrative post in Bengal, far from his homeland, with a promise of promotion if he served well. Rebellion became less attractive than cooperation. The Mughals also kept the old steppe tradition of marriage diplomacy alive. Mughal emperors married Rajput princesses, Persian noblewomen, and even Turkic brides from Central Asia, building a web of kinship that held the empire together. The Emperor Akbar, the greatest of the Mughals, took this further. He abolished the tax on non-Muslims and invited scholars of all faiths to his court. He created a new religion, the Din-i-Ilahi, that blended elements of Islam, Hinduism, and Zoroastrianism. Though it never attracted many followers, his goal was not religious conversion but political unity. By showing respect for the traditions of his subjects, he made the empire a place where steppe descendants and local Indians could coexist. The Mughal army, at its height, could field over 100,000 horsemen, many of them steppe-bred, along with tens of thousands of infantry and artillerymen. It was a hybrid force that could fight in the deserts of Rajasthan, the jungles of Bengal, and the mountains of Afghanistan. The steppe had come to India, but India had reshaped the steppe in return. The result was an empire that lasted more than 3 centuries, a testament to the power of adaptation and the enduring legacy of those who learned to blend the old ways with the new. Some empires chose not just to adapt but to transform the steppe itself. Instead of waiting for the next wave of horsemen to crash against their walls, they reached out and tried to reshape the grasslands from within. The Byzantines, masters of subtle statecraft, perfected the art of the nomadic buffer. They did not simply hire steppe warriors as mercenaries. They actively settled entire tribes along their frontiers, giving them land, grain, and recognition in exchange for a promise: you will guard this border against your own cousins. The Pechenegs, a Turkic people who had terrorized the Balkans for generations, were among the first to be drawn into this arrangement. Byzantine emperors offered them gifts, trading rights, and a place in the imperial hierarchy. In return, the Pechenegs became a living shield against even more dangerous nomads from the east, such as the Cumans and the Rus. Of course, this strategy was a gamble. A nomadic buffer could turn against its benefactor at any moment, and the Pechenegs did exactly that more than once. But the Byzantines understood that a controlled threat was far better than an uncontrolled one. Even when the buffer failed, it bought time, exhausted the invaders, and gave the imperial army a chance to mobilize. The Chinese took a similar but more systematic approach. For centuries, the Han and later dynasties maintained a policy of befriending the weaker steppe tribes in order to isolate the stronger ones. They called this using barbarians to control barbarians. Envoys would travel deep into the grasslands, bearing silk and tea, and identify chieftains who were willing to align with the empire. These allied tribes would be given grazing rights near the border, access to Chinese markets, and official titles that marked them as friends of the emperor. In exchange, they provided intelligence, horses, and military support against their nomadic rivals. This created a network of dependencies that made it far harder for any single steppe confederation to become powerful enough to threaten the empire. The Tang dynasty took this a step further by resettling entire surrendered tribes within the empire itself. After a campaign, captured nomads were not enslaved or executed. They were given land in the frontier provinces, taught agriculture, and slowly integrated into Chinese society. Their children learned to read and write Chinese characters. Their warriors were formed into auxiliary units under Chinese officers. Over time, the memory of the steppe faded, and these formerly fierce horsemen became loyal subjects who had no homeland left to fight for. This was a radical form of steppe-proofing. Instead of trying to build a wall high enough to keep the world out, you pulled the world inside and let it dissolve into your own culture. But the most subtle weapon in this arsenal was adopting steppe customs themselves. Byzantine emperors began to wear fur-trimmed robes and drink fermented mare's milk at diplomatic banquets. Chinese generals learned to speak the languages of the Turks and Mongols, and they memorized the genealogies of powerful clans so they could address a chieftain by his proper honorific. They understood that to control the steppe, you had to make yourself legible to the steppe. A nomad who felt respected was far more likely to listen to reason. And if a chieftain could be flattered into an alliance, 1,000 horsemen could be turned from a threat into a bargaining chip. These strategies did not eliminate the danger. No amount of resettlement or diplomacy could erase the fundamental tension between the settled and the mobile, but they bought centuries of relative peace. They turned the frontier from a simple line on a map into a complex, living zone where identities blurred and loyalties shifted. The steppe did not disappear, but it was contained, channeled, and in some ways transformed from within. The empires that mastered this art did not simply survive. They learned to live with the very force that had once threatened to destroy them, and in doing so, they made the steppe a part of their own story. These patterns did not fade with the Mughals or the Ming. They simply evolved into the diplomatic language of a new era, one where the old grassland empires had been replaced by rising powers that still faced the same fundamental challenge. The Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires, all children of the steppe, now competed for control of the lands that had once been the nomads' playground. And in that competition, they revived the ancient strategy of playing one steppe group against another. The Ottomans cultivated the Crimean Tatars as their northern shield, using them to raid and pressure their rivals. The Safavids, in turn, relied on Turkoman and Kurdish tribes to defend their highland frontiers against Ottoman incursions. Each empire understood that a well-timed subsidy to a chieftain could win a war without a single battle. This was the old heqin and tribute system, reborn in the age of gunpowder. Then came the Russians. As Muscovy expanded eastward into Siberia, they encountered a vast network of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples, from the Tatars of the Volga to the Buryats of Lake Baikal. The Russian Tsars did not simply conquer these groups by force. They adopted a strategy that would have been instantly familiar to a Han emperor or a Byzantine diplomat. They offered protection, trade, and conversion to Orthodox Christianity to some tribes while arming their rivals against others. Cossack adventurers pushed ahead, building forts and extracting tribute from local leaders, but the real work of subjugation was often done by dividing the steppe against itself. A Tatar prince who accepted Russian authority could keep his lands and even be given a noble title. A prince who resisted would find himself surrounded by hostile neighbors who had already been won over by Russian gifts. By the 19th century, this approach had matured into what historians call the Great Game, the rivalry between the British and Russian empires for influence in Central Asia. The British, from their base in India, watched nervously as Russian forces advanced through the Kazakh steppe toward the borders of Afghanistan. They responded by doing exactly what the steppe had taught every empire. They sent envoys to the emirs of Bukhara, the Khans of Khiva, and the tribal leaders of the Hindu Kush, offering weapons, money, and promises of support. They mapped the passes, learned the languages, and cultivated relationships that could be activated in a crisis. The Russians, for their part, used the same playbook. They recruited Kazakh and Turkmen horsemen into auxiliary units, built forts along the Sirdarya, and established a governor-general in Tashkent. They understood that controlling the steppe meant controlling the people who lived on it, not just the ground they traveled. The echoes of ancient steppe diplomacy were unmistakable. The tributary gifts that the Han had sent to the Xiongnu now became British subsidies to Afghan emirs. The marriage alliances that Byzantium had forged with Turkic khans were replaced by political treaties and trade agreements. The hostage system that had once guaranteed peace between Rome and the Huns was revived in the form of British officers being held as guests or prisoners in the courts of Central Asian rulers. The strategies had not changed, only the names of the powers had. By the time the borders of modern Central Asia were drawn in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the imprint of this centuries-long dance was visible everywhere. The division between Russian and British spheres of influence followed lines that had first been traced by the movement of nomadic confederations. The buffer states and protectorates that emerged were the direct descendants of the old tribute zones that had once cushioned empires from the steppe. And the habit of using tribal loyalties as a tool of statecraft did not disappear when the British left India or when the Soviet Union rose and fell. It remained a living part of geopolitics, passed down through the generations of diplomats and generals who had learned from the masters of the grasslands. The legacy of steppe diplomacy is not a museum piece. It is a current that still flows beneath the surface of international relations, reminding us that the oldest lessons are often the ones that outlast empires and reshape the world long after the horsemen have ridden into history. The tactics of the steppe did not vanish with the last Mongol raid. They seeped into the very textbooks of modern military theory, where generals and strategists who had never seen a horse archer in their lives began to study the principles these nomads had perfected over centuries. The core ideas were simple but revolutionary: light cavalry for scouting and skirmishing, mobility to choose the time and place of battle, feigned retreat to lure an enemy into a trap, and combined arms to use different troop types in coordination. These were not just tricks, they were a complete philosophy of war that prioritized speed, deception, and the ability to concentrate force at the decisive point. The Prussian military thinker Karl von Clausewitz, writing in the early 19th century, never explicitly wrote about steppe nomads, but his concept of friction, the chaos and uncertainty that every army must overcome, was a direct echo of the steppe experience. You could not predict where a horse archer would strike. You could not plan for an enemy that appeared and disappeared at will. You had to build an army that could adapt faster than the chaos could overwhelm it. That meant flexible units, decentralized command, and a deep understanding of terrain and timing. The steppe had taught these lessons through blood and fire, and Clausewitz gave them a theoretical framework. Later, the idea of reconnaissance as the eyes and ears of an army became a standard doctrine in every major military manual. Before the steppe, most armies marched blind, relying on scouts who rode only a few miles ahead. The nomads had developed a system of forward scouts who fanned out across the horizon, reporting enemy movements days before contact. Modern armies adopted this approach, creating dedicated light cavalry units or, later, aerial reconnaissance squadrons, all built on the same principle: knowledge is power, and the fastest way to gather knowledge is to see the enemy before he sees you. The feigned retreat, that classic steppe deception, became a staple of tactical training. Every officer learned to use a feigned withdrawal to draw an enemy out of a strong position, then strike from an unexpected direction. This maneuver was refined into the basis for modern mobile warfare, from the German blitzkrieg to the fast-moving armored columns of Desert Storm. Combined arms, the idea that infantry, cavalry, and later tanks, artillery, and aircraft must work together as one unit, also traces its lineage to the steppe. The Mongol army did not just rely on horse archers. It used heavy lancers for shock, engineers for siege work, and light cavalry for pursuit. Every part supported the others. Modern military theory calls this combined arms maneuver, and it is the foundation of how every advanced army operates today. Even special operations, the small, highly mobile units that strike behind enemy lines and vanish, carry the DNA of the steppe raider. Their ethos of speed, surprise, and independence, their ability to live off the land and communicate over vast distances, all of these echo the habits of the ancient horsemen who never needed a supply depot. The men who wrote the manuals for modern unconventional warfare, from the British Special Air Service to the American Green Berets, were students of history. They studied the Mongols, the Cossacks, and the tribal raiders of the Eurasian frontier, and they distilled those lessons into training programs that are still used today. So when you watch a news report of a helicopter assault or a rapid armored thrust across the desert, remember that the ghost of a horse archer is riding alongside. The steppe did not just win battles, it shaped the very grammar of how we think about conflict, mobility, and surprise. And that grammar is still being written, one operation at a time, by soldiers who may never have heard of the Xiongnu or the Huns, but who carry their wisdom in every movement they make. Yet the steppe was never just a source of conflict. The very pressure that forced empires to reinvent their armies also opened a corridor of exchange that would shape the modern world. The Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean, did not emerge from peaceful cooperation alone. It was built on the back of nomadic mobility. The same horsemen who terrified settled cities also carried goods, ideas, and technologies across vast distances with a speed that no farmer could match. A silk merchant traveling with a steppe caravan could cover in weeks what a lone trader would need months to accomplish. And because the nomads controlled the grasslands between major civilizations, they became the indispensable middlemen, the connectors who made long-distance trade possible. The famous Silk Road was not a single road but a web of paths, and the steppe was its spine. This constant movement of people and goods did more than enrich merchants. It spread technologies that transformed entire societies. Consider the stirrup, a simple piece of metal or wood that allowed a rider to stand in the saddle and deliver a blow with the full weight of his horse behind it. The stirrup originated in the steppes of Central Asia, likely among the nomadic peoples who needed it to fight from horseback. From there, it spread westward into Persia, then into Europe, where it helped give rise to the armored knight, the dominant warrior of the medieval age. Without the stirrup, the heavy cavalry charge that decided so many battles would have been impossible. The steppe had given Europe its most fearsome weapon, only for that weapon to be turned back against the grasslands centuries later. Then there was paper. The Chinese had developed papermaking as early as the 2nd century before the Common Era, but the knowledge of how to produce it remained largely confined to East Asia for centuries. It was the movement of people along the steppe corridor, including Buddhist monks, Turkic traders, and later Mongol administrators, that carried the technique westward. By the 8th century, paper mills appeared in Samarkand, then in Baghdad, and eventually across the Islamic world and into Europe. The ability to produce books, records, and documents on a large scale transformed education, bureaucracy, and the spread of ideas. The printing press, which would later revolutionize Europe, could never have taken hold without a cheap and abundant source of paper. That paper traveled along the same routes that horsemen had ridden for millennia. Gunpowder, too, followed the steppe. Invented in China, likely during the Tang Dynasty, its recipe was slowly transmitted westward through the vast territories of the Mongol Empire. By the time it reached Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries, it was already being refined into cannons and handguns. The Mongol conquests had accidentally created the conditions for this transfer. unifying a huge stretch of Eurasia under a single political system where ideas could travel without constant interruption. A Chinese engineer working for the Mongol Khan might share his knowledge with a Persian colleague who would pass it on to a Syrian or Italian merchant. The steppe was not just a highway for silk and spices, it was a highway for the very technologies that would define the modern age. Cultural diffusion happened on a deeper level as well. Persian miniature painting influenced Chinese art. Indian mathematics reached the Islamic world through steppe intermediaries. The game of chess, which originated in India, was carried across Central Asia by traders and eventually became a favorite pastime in European courts. Buddhist missionaries traveled the same paths as Mongol warriors, establishing monasteries in the oases of the Tarim Basin and introducing new philosophies to the peoples of the steppe. In return, shamanistic and animist traditions from the grasslands influenced the development of mystical schools within Islam and Christianity. The boundaries between civilizations blurred along the steppe corridor, creating a melting pot of ideas that no single empire could control. The relationship between military pressure and cultural exchange was deeply intertwined. A chieftain who raided a Chinese border town might bring back not only silk and gold but also a captured scholar who could read and write. That scholar, if treated well, could become a bridge between two worlds, teaching the nomads about medicine, astronomy, and statecraft. In turn, the steppe people taught their captors about horsemanship, survival in harsh climates, and the art of moving unseen. Each raid, each negotiation, each marriage alliance was also an exchange, a moment when knowledge passed from one culture to another. The very friction that empires tried so hard to reduce was also the engine of innovation. So while the steppe forced civilizations to reinvent war and diplomacy, it also forced them to open their borders, to listen and to learn. The Silk Road was not a peaceful highway by nature. It was a dangerous, unpredictable corridor where merchants risked their lives alongside warriors. But out of that danger came a richness that no wall could contain. The technologies and ideas that traveled with the horsemen would outlast every empire that tried to stop them, and they would eventually connect the entire world in ways that the nomads themselves could never have imagined. For centuries, the steppe was remembered as a place of terror and ruin. When settled civilizations wrote their histories, they painted the nomads as barbarians, as destroyers who swept in from nowhere to burn cities and slaughter the innocent. Roman writers described the Huns as creatures barely human, more beast than man, driven by an insatiable hunger for destruction. Chinese chroniclers spoke of the Xiongnu as greedy wolves, a plague that had to be contained by walls and military campaigns. These descriptions were not just records of events, they were a way of making sense of a threat that defied every expectation. A people who did not build cities, who did not plant fields, who did not worship the same gods, could only be understood as a force of chaos. And so the steppe became a symbol of the wild, the untamed, the enemy of civilization itself. But this memory was never complete. The same empires that condemned the nomads as barbarians also borrowed their weapons, their tactics, and even their clothing. Roman soldiers adopted the long-sleeved tunics and trousers of the steppe because they were more practical for cavalry. Chinese generals studied the Mongol way of war and recruited steppe horsemen into their own armies. Byzantine diplomats wore fur and drank fermented milk at the court of the Khans, not out of respect alone but because they understood that to influence the steppe, you had to speak its language. There was a deep contradiction at work. The very people who were vilified as destroyers were also secretly admired for their skill, their resilience, and their freedom. A Roman historian might shudder at the mention of the Huns, but a young nobleman might dream of riding like one. This dichotomy has persisted long after the last horse archer vanished from the plains. In popular culture, the steppe nomad is often portrayed as a savage brute, a mindless horde, or a romantic figure of untamed wilderness. The Mongol is either a monster or a hero, rarely a complex human being with a culture, a code, and a history. Historians have struggled to break free of this binary, to show that the relationship between settled and nomadic societies was never one of simple destruction, but of constant interaction, borrowing, and transformation. The steppe did not just destroy, it forced change, it catalyzed innovation, and in doing so, it left a mark on every civilization it touched, whether they admitted it or not. The tension between condemnation and admiration tells us something important about how we remember the past. Every society needs a villain to define itself against, a mirror that shows what it does not want to become. But that mirror also reflects hidden desires. The settled world envied the nomad's mobility, his freedom from taxes, his ability to move with the seasons. They feared him, but they also secretly wished they could be a little more like him. That is why the steppe continues to fascinate us, why we still study the Mongols and the Huns and the Scythians. They represent a way of life that the modern world has almost entirely lost, a way that was brutal and uncertain, but also deeply alive. The barbarian was never just a destroyer. He was a teacher, an adversary, and a ghost that still haunts our imagination. The steppe did not simply change the settled world. The settled world changed the steppe right back. This was not a one-way street where nomads attacked and empires adapted. It was a co-evolution, a long dance in which each side shaped the other in ways that would have been impossible alone. The very structure of nomadic societies, their leadership, their alliances, their political organization, was often a direct response to the pressure coming from the great agricultural empires along their borders. When the Xiongnu formed their first great confederation, they did so partly to defend against the expanding Han Dynasty, but also to negotiate from a position of strength. A scattered collection of clans could demand a few bolts of silk. A unified steppe power could demand a princess and a formal tribute treaty. Over time, settled empires learned to manipulate these confederations, to break them apart through gifts and intrigues. And the nomads, in turn, learned to use the resources they extracted, grain, metal, luxury goods, to strengthen their own internal structures. A chieftain who could distribute Chinese silk to his warriors earned their loyalty. A Khan who could offer his followers access to Byzantine gold built a power base that no rival could match. Trade was not just an economic exchange, it was a political tool that reshaped the steppe from within. The Mongols, often seen as the purest expression of nomadic power, were themselves a product of this co-evolution. Before Genghis Khan united them, the Mongol tribes had been fragmented and weak. It was the pressure from the neighboring Jin dynasty of northern China, a settled empire, that forced them to organize or be destroyed. Genghis did not just rely on old steppe traditions. He borrowed ideas from the civilizations he conquered, the decimal army organization from the Khitans, the siege engineers from the Chinese, the writing system from the Uyghurs. He built an empire that was part nomadic and part settled, a hybrid that could move like the steppe but administer like a kingdom. The very existence of the Mongol Empire was a testament to how deeply the settled world had influenced the steppe. Without the constant engagement of trade, diplomacy, and war, the nomads might never have formed such large and durable political structures, and those structures, once built, would go on to reshape the settled world in turn. Missions also played a role. Buddhist monks traveled from India and China into the steppe, carrying scriptures and ideas that slowly transformed nomadic spirituality. Nestorian Christian missionaries made converts among the Turkic tribes, and later, Islam spread across Central Asia, carried by merchants and Sufi preachers who followed the caravan routes. Each new religion brought with it a new way of thinking about authority, law, and community. A Khan who adopted Buddhism might begin to build monasteries and sponsor translations of sacred texts. A chieftain who converted to Islam might start to use Arabic script for his decrees and send envoys to the caliph. These changes did not erase the old steppe ways. They blended with them, creating belief systems that were neither fully nomadic nor fully settled. The result was a dynamic of mutual reinvention. Every raid, every treaty, every marriage alliance was also an act of exchange. The settled empires learned to think like the steppe, and the steppe learned to think like the empires. Neither side remained unchanged, and that co-evolution did not end with the Mongol collapse. It continued through the rise of the gunpowder empires, through the colonial era, and into the modern world, where the borders and political traditions of Central Asia still bear the marks of this ancient dance. The horse had carried the steppe far, but it was the constant friction with the settled world that gave the nomads the tools to build something that would echo across millennia. This centuries-long pressure, this constant friction between the grassland and the plow, did not simply destroy or reshape individual empires. It became the engine behind some of the most fundamental innovations in how human societies organize power. Every time a civilization faced a raid that could not be stopped by walls alone, it was forced to invent something new. The horse archer demanded a response, and that response, whether it was the Roman limitane, the Chinese heqin system, the Byzantine foederati, or the Ottoman janissaries, became a building block for the modern state. The very concept of a standing army, paid by a central treasury and loyal to a distant ruler, emerged largely because of the need to counter a threat that could appear and disappear faster than any feudal levy could muster. The idea of a fortified frontier, not just a wall but a living zone of patrols, signal towers, and permanent garrisons, was refined over centuries of trying to contain the horsemen. And the art of diplomacy, of negotiating with enemies who did not share your language or your gods, was born in the tents of steppe khans who demanded respect before they would even listen. Without the steppe, the map of the modern world would look very different. The borders of Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey all bear the scars of this ancient struggle. The technologies that linked the continents, paper, gunpowder, the stirrup, the compass, all traveled along the pathways carved by nomadic movement. The very idea that a state must invest in intelligence, in understanding its neighbors, in building relationships that outlast any single leader, was learned in the hard school of the grassland. The horsemen who rode out of the east did not simply vanish when their empires fell. They left behind a legacy of adaptation, a reminder that the greatest force for change is often the one you least expect. And that legacy is still alive today in every border patrol, every diplomatic mission, every military manual that emphasizes speed and surprise. The next time you hear about a crisis on a distant frontier, remember the horse archer. He is the ghost at the feast of modern geopolitics, the invisible hand that taught civilization how to defend itself, how to negotiate, and how to survive. This story is not over. It is simply being written in new languages, on new battlefields, with new technologies, but the fundamental truth remains the same. The greatest innovations often come not from comfort, but from the relentless pressure of a challenge you cannot ignore. If you enjoyed this journey through the grasslands and the empires they shaped, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more hidden forces waiting to be uncovered, stories of how the past continues to shape the world we live in today. Leave a comment with your thoughts. What other historical pressures do you think have shaped the modern world? I will see you in the next video.